So the first module today is Module 3, Modeling an App. So our learning objectives for Module 3 are create and manage a Genero Mobile project file. You may already be familiar with Genero projects, but we'll talk about the Genero Mobile project. There's a specific type of project that you can create for a Genero Mobile project that adds some infrastructure and some special features that make it easier for you to develop within BAM. So we have a special Genero Mobile for BAM type project. Also, we'll learn about modeling an app with a BA diagram. Remember, BA just stands for Business Application Diagram. That's our high-level diagram that we can use to model the flow of our application. And then we can increment it or develop it in increments or steps as we get ready. So we can finish one part before we move on to the next part. So it makes it a lot easier to develop a complex application that way. We'll also talk about working with program, form, and mobile entities. We'll take a look at all the different types of entities and briefly look at the properties for them. We'll also add relationships between entities and talk about the relationship or relation properties. And relation properties essentially affect the behavior of that form when it's opened for a specific task. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. We'll also talk about setting properties just in general to affect code generation. I've already mentioned that the properties are not just in one place. So we'll be looking at properties for the individual form entities that we create. We'll be looking at properties for these record diagrams that we talked about some yesterday. We have properties for relations that we'll talk about. There's a lot of different properties. So these will all start making sense and everything will start coming together as we work through the next 3 or 4 chapters. So again, if you don't understand everything about properties today, that's okay and to be expected because there's a lot of them. It's kind of a lot to put together. So we're starting out pretty simply with the mobile project files. I mentioned a minute ago that there's a special type of project for Genero Mobile and another special type of project for BAM, a BAM mobile project. That's kind of a mouthful. But essentially when you create a new BAM mobile project, you get a lot of features, functionality, and structure that simplifies creating your project with BAM. You get a special project structure, you get a special directory structure underneath the covers that makes it easier to package your application when you're finished, and you also get some special database features that we'll talk about in Chapter 4 today. So when you create your new Genero Mobile BAM mobile project and you give it a name and a location, like you see down here at the bottom, they're using D Quick Start for their directory location, that becomes your project dir. You'll notice that when we look at build rules and a lot of environment variables, they're based on this concept of the project dir. And all the project dir is the location you select when you create your new project. Here's the default predefined mobile project. So when you create a new BAM mobile project, this is the structure for your project that you get. Let me grab a highlighter here so I can point out a few things. You have this database maintenance mode up here at the top. That will be there, and there will already be a create database application node. This node that looks like a disk in the middle of it there, that orange disk, is an application node. So this create database application node that's created by default in your project is there and has the script in it that's used to create an empty database for your new project. It's not completely empty. We'll come back to that in just a few moments, but it doesn't have any tables or columns in there that you would use directly for your project. More maintenance and administrative type functions. We also have a packages node, and that might be kind of self-explanatory is what that's for, but that's one of the built-in features I mentioned for a mobile project that is there to help simplify the packaging process. When you've finished developing your app and you're ready to deploy it, or perhaps you just want to test it by deploying it to a physical device, you can use these packaging nodes, and they help simplify gathering together all the resources that are needed for packaging. And you can see that we have special package nodes here for Android and iOS. Then finally down here, this is what we call a group, and there's another group. I should have pointed these out. This project already has 3 groups in it. You can create additional groups if you want to. When you're getting in and organizing your project, you're free to create additional groups, name them whatever you like, and then you can also add additional structures that we're looking at here. Databases, entities, resources, resource files, that type of thing. Here in a few minutes we'll actually take a look at the Pool Doctors project so that you can see how it's been organized. They've done a lot with the basic default organization to make it simpler for them to work with Pool Doctors, and you're free to do the same thing. So here there's a default application node, and this is intended for your mobile application. And of course you can rename that. You don't have to leave it application. You can call it Pool Doctors or whatever the name of your application needs to be. There's an additional library node. That's what this node is, with the yellow with the green inside. That's a library node. And the library node here is a default library node that actually contains your BA diagram. This appflow.4BA is a BA diagram that's not quite empty. It has some starter entities in it, but there's not much in there yet because it's a brand new project. So by default it's called appflow.ba. And again, you can rename all of these different nodes in your application, different files as you see fit. There's a config library that contains an important file for Genero called the FGL profile file. And it has a lot of your profile information. Things like environment variables can be put in the FGL profile file. All kinds of settings that are database related can be in the FGL profile file. So it's an important concept with Genero, and we'll be taking a look at that more in Chapter 4. We'll start looking at it from a database perspective there. But you do have a default FGL profile already in your brand new project, and the purpose of that being there for now is to point to this default database that you have here. So we have a database library built in, and it already has an empty, right there, empty database. And with Genero Mobile, the only database that you can use locally on a device is a SQLite database. So this mydatabase.db is basically an empty SQLite database. Again, there is one table in it that we'll talk about in Chapter 4, but for all intents and purposes, it's just an empty database for you to use to create your tables and columns that you want to use for your application. This file right above the .db file that I've already highlighted by mistake there, that .4dbx, is your metaschema file. And we'll talk a lot about the database files and the metaschema files in Chapter 4 today. But that metaschema file we talked some about yesterday has all the metadata about the database in it. And when you're working on an application, building forms, when the code generator is defining variables like database columns, that type of thing, it's actually using the information in this mydatabase.4dbx file. Yours, of course, may not be named mydatabase, but the 4dbx file. There's 2 different kinds of metaschema files. There's a DB extension, and then there's a DBX extension. And for mobile projects, with BAM, we use the 4dbx, and I'll explain all the details about why we use this one instead of the .4db in the next chapter. Then finally, down at the bottom, we have an entities and a resources library node at the bottom there by default. And of course, the entities node is there to put all of your project entities in. For example, all of the form entities that you're working on. And again, we'll go back to the Pool Doctors project so that you can see how people have implemented some of these different nodes in the project structure. And then there's also a resources library, and the resources library is intended for you to be able to store different types of Genero resources like styles files, action default files, and that type of thing. So there's your predefined mobile project. It comes with all of these different pieces and parts. It also comes with a default directory structure, and I'll show you that default directory structure when we finish this topic in the chapter. So a moment ago I pointed out some of the different types of nodes in a project, and that's what this is referring to. You can organize your project any way you like by using some of these nodes, like group nodes. I pointed out 3 different group nodes on the last slide, which is identical. This is a group node where they've put all the database maintenance components. There's a packages nodes that I mentioned is used for packaging your application when you're ready to deploy it. And then they have a project group. So we have 3 different groups that are already configured, but you can create subgroups, which is why we have another level of groups here in the slide. We have application nodes, and by default we have this application node here, and of course you can change the name of that. We have library nodes. We have several of those, this application flow, config, database, and of course the intention there is to store libraries of files that you need for your project and be able to organize them however you like. We also have virtual folders. I don't see any virtual folders in this particular view, but when we do a look at the Pool Doctors project here in a few minutes, we'll open it up so that you can see some of these virtual folders. They're typically used to hold, let's say, all of the components of a form, all the files that are generated for a specific form. That's at least the way that the Pool Doctors apps uses the virtual folders. You can use them for various things, but that's probably the most common. All right, I think we've talked about all the different types of nodes. And all these different types of nodes have their own set of properties. So specifically here they've picked the project properties or the application properties. So the application node has its own set of properties. For example, the target directory for compiled files. There's external dependencies if you need to specify external programs that you want to include in the build process, that type of thing, you can specify it here. Command line arguments. Typically you don't work with these too much. I've only used the exclude from build a few times, for example, because I had files out there that I wanted to be able to reference, but I didn't want them to be included in the actual build of the project. So some options there for the application node. But every different node in the project view has its own set of properties. I think the only exception to that might be the virtual folders that we aren't able to see here. But again, I'll show them to you when we come to a stopping point. Everything else has its own set of properties. We have menus, right-click menus on all the different nodes in the project. And of course the application node, you would expect to have options like this where you can execute the application. You have options to execute it with the profiler to see if you have any specific parts of the program that it's spending the most time in, basically looking for bottlenecks with that profiler. You can debug right here from the right-click menu. So there's a lot of different options for each type of node, and it is context sensitive. So the menu options that you get for the application node will be slightly different from the menu options you get, for example, with the package nodes or the different directories under the package nodes. So they're all context sensitive. You can right-click on an application node, and there's an Advanced Properties option in the menu. And that Advanced Properties option will show you all of your dependencies. There's 3 or 4 different tabs that you can look at. The one that I'm usually in there looking at first is Dependencies. These dependencies let you specify build dependencies. So if your project depends on some of these different libraries, for example, that you have in your project structure, like database, entities, resources, like a styles file or an action defaults files, you can specify that dependency here in Advanced Properties. So one of the reasons you might go and look at these advanced properties is maybe you try to build your project or compile a file and you get an error. And if you get an error that specifies it can't find a file, for example, or can't find something, a lot of times it'll be because you don't have these dependencies set and it's not looking for everything that's required. So don't forget the dependencies, the Advanced Properties Dependencies option. Sometimes that's a pretty helpful thing when you're first starting out especially. You've also got an area here where you can define pre and post link commands. Typically those are fine, at least it's going to be fine for all the things we're doing here in class this week. And typically your environment variables are okay with the defaults, but there are times when you do need to go in and specify changes to the environment variables or add directories to a specific environment variables. So that was a pretty quick topic. This is probably the best place to go ahead and show you some of these things that I was talking about so you can see beyond what those screenshots have in them. So here it's jumping off into a different topic where we're going to start looking at these BA diagrams and all the different types of diagrams that we use for BAM. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up Genero Mobile so that we can see a few of these things that we saw in the first topic. So the first thing we talked about was creating a new project. So here I've just got File, New, and then right here in the Design category there's this BAM Mobile project, and that's the one we've been looking at in the screenshots and in the slides. You've got another option down here under Genero Files, that category, called Mobile Project. So you can use that as well if you're working on a mobile project. But if you're using BAM, you'll want to use this one in the Design category because it adds a lot of these special features and functions that make it easier to work with BAM. That default directory structure, the default database, and so on. So you'll want to use that option. And then down here at the bottom, all you have to do is put in the name of your project. I'm just going to call mine Test for today. And then you specify a location. I set up a demo folder that I'm going to use for our location, and now that becomes our projector that we talked about earlier in this chapter. Now I'm just going to say OK. So now here I get that same default structure that we saw a few minutes ago in the screenshots. There's my database maintenance group, my packages group, and my project group. And under this database maintenance group, here's this create database application node. And it does come, now we can pop that open. It already comes with a program that you can use to create essentially an empty database. And again, it's not quite empty. You can see that it has a special table called SecReg in it, and we'll come back to that in Chapter 4 today. But it does have a script that's used to create your empty database. You already have a database provided with this default project. So I'm going to pop down there and show you these files. Here's this My Database DB. That's basically an empty SQLite database that just has this one SecReg table that we've been talking about some. And again, we'll come back to that in Chapter 4. And then here's our metaschema file that goes along with that default database. Now, of course, just like everything else, you can change the names of these database file and the metaschema file to something that suits you better than My Database. Now, if you do change the name of these, one of the things you'll need to do is change your settings here in the FTL profile. So let's take a look at that FTL profile. Comes with your project. And right up here, it's specifying the default driver, or the database driver for the SQLite database, which is DBM SQT. And then right here, it's specifying the database, my database, and then it's specifying the name of the database file, mydatabase.db. So if you do decide to change the names of your database file here in the project and the metaschema file, you need to change them both so that they match, and then you also need to update your FGL profile here to point to your new database and specify the correct database name. So just a few things here to address just in case you make any changes. We'll see that again, I think, in the database chapter, but it doesn't hurt to look at it twice. Now, in your project view, you also have a default BA diagram. There's not much here. There's just a program entity, and they've used the default name main, and then they have one CRUD form entity. And we're just about to get into the topic where we'll talk about all these different types of entities, program entities, form entities, the different types of form entities that you can pick. So I won't do it here. I'll just kind of show you this, and then we'll come back to it in the second topic. But you do have a default BA diagram, and it's started for you. Now, you don't have to keep these, right? You can delete them and start from scratch if you want to. But they're very, very basic, and you could easily use those to get started with. Let's see, just trying to think if there was anything else. Let me show you the directory structure, I guess would be the next useful thing to see here. Pop that down for just a second. Now, when I created that default project, I also have this special structure, default directory structure, that gets set up for me as well. And this is all here to help me organize my files and to simplify the process of packaging my project when I'm ready to deploy it. So I've got a special folder here for app flow for my BA diagram. I've got this special config directory here to hold that FGL profile. A lot of these correspond with your project directory structure that we were just looking at a few minutes ago. So these should look familiar to you. So that has the FGL profile, or that's what it's for. Here's the database directory that, of course, is intended to hold your database metaschema file and your database file. Here's the database maintenance directory that's supposed to hold the files that we saw earlier that are in that database maintenance group. So any files that you're using during your project development to go out and work with the database, to update it, for example, should be saved to this directory. And then here's a directory especially for saving image files that you use in your project. Here's a resource directory where you'd keep your special resource files associated with Genero. Well, we'll talk about those resource files in a later chapter. So if you're not familiar with them, don't be too concerned about it now, because we'll talk about them. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, we'll get into these resource files. But special resource files like styles files, Atchin default files, and that type of thing. And then we have our source directory. And of course, that one's kind of self-explanatory. That's where your source files are supposed to be stored. And then there's a special directory for web components. We have a whole chapter on advanced topics, and one of the advanced topics is web components. So we'll get into all the details on web components and where those should be stored and how you integrate those into your project later on next week. And then finally, the last thing in this directory structure is there because I added this new project and called it test. So this is the project file, the .4pw file that keeps track of all my project structures. All the stuff in that project are tracked by this file. Let's see. Trying to think if there's anything else useful for you while we're talking about the project view. Let me just pop up the Pool Doctors project real quick so you can see the difference between what the project structure looks like here and what it looked like in the default. If you remember, the project structure that you get by default is pretty simple. There's several different types of nodes there, but there's not a lot of them. And you can see here that this Pool Doctors project has been added to. We've got a lot of new libraries that have been added to this project. There's our default database maintenance. We have default package group. We have sources here. And then here's our BA diagram. Notice they've renamed it Pool Doctors App Flow. So again, you can rename things as you wish when you work with your project. You don't have to use these default names. So there's the Pool Doctors App Flow. That's the BA diagram for Pool Doctors. Pull that up so you can see a little of it. And we'll be looking at this BA diagram a lot this week. So kind of an introduction to it here. There's the FGL profile and the config library. So some of these libraries are default libraries, and then you can see some of them are not default, like this LibSplash, LibSync, LibSystem have been set up to organize some files that are used for other parts of the project. A lot of these are related to some of the custom code that's being done in the project, and some of them are related to working with some of the web components in the project. And we'll revisit those next week. Then down here, there's a lot that's been done here with the application node structure underneath the application node. These are the virtual folders that I was talking about earlier. We couldn't see any of those in our screenshot, but you can see there's a lot of them here for the Pool Doctors project. So they've added several here just to organize all the different files related to the different entities in the project. So that way when you're looking for a specific forms, files, you can find them much more quickly than if you just had all these lumped together in one big folder. So they've got several here. It also makes it easier for us to do the class because we can refer you to a specific virtual folder and you can find a specific file in here much more quickly than if we sent you just to one big virtual folder that had 100 files in it. So keep that in mind when you're working on your projects. It helps a lot of times to organize your project so that you have groups and subgroups, and use virtual folders to organize the files from these different entities so that it doesn't get too overwhelming. So that's the Pool Doctors project view, and you can see that it's more complex than the default because they've been working on the project a while and have added to it. Something else, might take a peek here at the advanced properties for Pool Doctors so you can see what that looks like. So here's that dependencies property that we were talking about earlier. And you can see all the different build dependencies that we have for the Pool Doctors application. So we need to know the config directory, things we need to find to be able to do the build. The database needs to be included. This live application needs to be included. There's web components used in the application, so they've made sure to include the files that are in the live web component library. Resources, there's special resource files that have been created for this project that need to be included, and so on. So there's the dependencies property. Something else that's useful sometimes is this display environment. If you right-click on display environment, you can see all your environment settings. Sometimes when you're having problems, I've used this for tracking down things with images before. Like I'd have an image out there and it wasn't in one of the directories that it was actually looking for. And you can go out here and look to see where it's searching for all these things. There's environment variables that are related to the source paths that it's searching, library directories that it's searching for, including the Genero Studio library directory, all kinds of different environment variables. So it's useful to know that that's there whenever you're trying to debug especially. So you can see all the different environment variables that that application is using by right-clicking and using that display environment setting. All right, well, I can't think of anything useful or more useful to show you right now, so let's go ahead and pop out of that for now. And let's go ahead and go back to the PowerPoints and pick up where we left off. So that first topic was talking about the project view and all the different structures and built-in behavior of the project when you first create it. And the second topic is talking about all of these different BAM diagrams, like modeling an app using BAM. So we're going to model the app using these BAM diagrams. The whole job of the code generator with BAM is to build and compile the files for us, and then we can execute the files. And right now, while we're in this development mode that we're in, we're going to be displaying our files to this emulator that you configured in your labs previously. Later, of course, we can package and then deploy them to a physical device if we want to, or you can work with the physical device instead of an emulator while you're in development mode. So the business application diagram. We looked at the Pool Doctors 4BA a few minutes ago, the business application diagram for it, and it has a lot of different entities and relations in it. So kind of starting at the beginning, when you start creating your entities, you're going to start out with a program entity, typically. We have one program entity here per application, of course, and that's right here. So typically we start with that, give it some good name instead of that default name main that we saw a minute ago, and then typically you're going to start out next with a form. So you do have a couple of choices with forms. It's a pretty straightforward choice, though. You have a choice between a CRUD form, which is our general purpose form that's create, read, update, and or delete functionality, and it's typically used just for interacting with data. The only time we use a Zoom form is when we're allowing the user to make a selection by picking it from a list. So that can be useful for things like customer IDs, right? If I've got a customer ID but I don't happen to know the ID of a customer, I can go ahead and maybe pick the customer from a list by picking by the name. So that would be a common use for a Zoom form, is showing the user columns from the table, for example, that help him make a selection from a list that are more intuitive than some of these things we use for primary keys or foreign keys like customer code or job code, that type of thing. So a Zoom form is just to allow a user to select a value. The only type of functionality that you have for a Zoom form is just search functionality, to allow the user to search through a large list of items to make a selection. So you can see that the choice is pretty easy for forms. You have the choice between CRUD forms and Zoom forms, and of course most of the time it's going to be a CRUD form, a general purpose form. So here you can see that most of the forms here are CRUD forms. We talked about understanding the application flow by looking at the diagram some yesterday. So here we can see that the first form that a user sees is going to be this account selection form, which is a CRUD form. And depending on the selections he makes there, he'll either have the accounts form opened and displayed for him or the orders form from that point, depending on options he chooses inside the account selection form. And then from there you can see he can go on to orders, and then from order he can look probably at order details here, and then from order details he can do a zoom to look up an account. He can make a phone call or send an email based on these device entities that have been configured here. And then you've also got order lines, which are most likely details, additional details about that order. So it's hard to know without actually looking at the form, so we're just guessing, but that's the general idea. He goes from accounts and selects an account, and then he can look at the orders for that account and then drill down into various parts of those orders. So here's the BA diagram. You can see here how to create a new relation. This is probably a good place for me to do a quick demo of adding entities to a BA diagram. So I'm going to pop back into, we'll just go with our empty project that we just created. Right, here's our new project that we created a few moments ago in the first topic. So this will work just fine for showing you all the steps to creating entities. When you first start out, you don't need to worry about the database or anything else. You can just go out here and try to get your program flow in place, and then you can work on it from there. So I can start here with new. Typically we'll want to start with a new program. Whoops, didn't mean to click it. And then I can call it whatever I want to. And this time I will use kind of a silly name. I'll call it My App. So notice these green pluses on the entity. That tells you that it's a new unimplemented entity. That means that it doesn't have any code generated for it yet, and it won't have any code generated for it until you go in and implement it. Notice that there's a right-click option for that part. So this is a brand new entity. There is no generated code yet to see. I'm just modeling my application flow. And then from there, I can create a new form. And I'm just going to pick a CRUD form, the general purpose form. And again, I can give it a name. And again, it has the green plus on it because it has not yet been implemented. We'll learn all about implementing forms, and you'll do a nice lab on implementing forms in Chapter 5. And from there, typically, you're going to create a relation. So there's a new relation option here. Click on that and just drag your arrow over to your form. And make sure you can see these properties. Now the important part of all of this, as you'll learn over the next week or two, is that you have tremendous control over the behavior of this form by tweaking and changing the form, the relation, and the record properties. So there's an awful lot that you can do to manage the behavior of your application with these properties. So here, if you look at the form properties, here we go, you can see that better, I think. There's a lot of different properties. We've got properties here that determine the behavior of the form when it's first opened, this open mode. Notice the default is display. So when this form is open, it assumes it's just going to be in display mode. The user can't go in and change something that he's looking at when it initially opens or delete it. It's just display mode at this point. We've also got different settings for display behavior. What do you want to do if you're doing, the form's open, it's displaying data, and the user selects accept or cancel. You have different options on what you want the form behavior to be when a user selects one of these options. You can exit out of the form, which will put you back in the previous form, which is not really a very good option in this case because I don't have a previous form, or I can exit the app. So notice too that, let's say I pick that and I can't remember what the default is and I want to go back to the default. That arrow right there, the reset value, is a revert option. So if I change this and later I come back in and think, maybe I was better off when I was just using all the defaults, then I can click this reset value button and it puts me back to what the default was. Although it's not behaving that way yet because we haven't implemented this form, I guess. So we'll set it back to exit form. Typically, if those are enabled, that means that the form has been implemented and you can change the behavior for it. So we have all these different types of behaviors. If the form is open in modify mode, you can define the behavior that it has. If the user accepts or cancels or closes, add and search. Even the relation has a lot of properties. And we'll be looking at all these different properties as we go along this week. I won't spend too much time on them right here because we'll look at them some more in this chapter and we'll look at them some more tomorrow as well. One thing that's probably useful to know is if you click on a property, let's say I don't really understand one of these properties. So let's say it's Action. So if I don't understand it, I can highlight it like that, I can select it, and then I can hit F1. And if I hit F1, that brings up the doc to a page that will explain that to me. And so there's the Action property. So that's useful when you're in the middle of trying to configure a form, for example, and there's a property there, you're not sure exactly how that property works. You can just highlight it, or actually just select it and then hit F1, and that'll bring up the doc to the right page. Alright, so let's pop back into the PowerPoints for a few minutes till we see something else interesting to go look at. So there was talking a bit about adding entities and relations to the BA diagram. Now at this point, with those green plus signs on them, that means they're not implemented. So if they're not implemented, there's no code to look at, not really anything to do with the entity yet. It's just there to help you figure out and design the flow of the application. When you're ready to implement it, then you use the implement option. And there's special implement options for the forms that we'll look at in a bit. Whoops, I needed to mention that to you. You can add entities, and I mentioned earlier that when you're working with your project, you can do it piecemeal, one step at a time, and do it incrementally. And the way you do that is you can add your entities, but you don't have to put the relations between the entities. You don't have to implement the forms until you're ready. So you can do this in stages and get one piece of the application working just like you want it to, get all the properties set so that the behaviors are what you want, and then you can go on to the next set of entities if you want to, just one at a time if you like. So here's some program entity properties. There's not a lot of properties for the program entity, just basically the location and name of the file for program entities. CRUD form entities we looked at some a minute ago. If you change a property, notice that it shows up in bold. That tells you it's not the default value anymore. That can be useful when you've changed something and later on you decide it's not working as well for you as it was before. It makes it easier for you to see that you've made that change and what you changed. So it shows up in bold if it's not the default. Talked earlier about using this arrow, the reset arrow next to the property to reset it. So that way it goes back to the default mode, which is helpful if you can't remember what the default mode was. So all of these different properties we just reviewed, but we'll see these again in more detail later. Now Zoom forms, they've already mentioned, they don't have a lot of functionality. You can only display and search. So Zoom forms have a limited set of behaviors that you can change with these properties. So we've got display behavior and search behavior. And those are the only two types of behaviors that a Zoom form has. Now these are relation properties, and again we'll look at these in detail several times this week just to pick one particular property, for example, and analyze it and see exactly what it can do for us to change the behavior of a form for a certain task. But for now we'll just think of this as an overview, get a general idea of the properties in the relations. So up here they've got the name of the relation, and of course the type is relation, that's a type of entity. The source is the order entity. Notice the relation is coming from the order entity to the line item list entity, so that's the destination. There's an optional description here that you can fill in. We'll talk about the position, the source field here when we talk about Zoom forms a bit later on. Those are used a lot with Zoom forms, or they're required for Zoom forms. And we've got a filter, a set of filter properties, source field and destination fields, that you can use to make sure that unique values are being selected using typically the primary key. So more on that later. And this is the action that's being used to trigger this line item list form to cause it to be displayed. There's an action or an option that the user selected to make that happen, and that's the name of the action that's been selected. Open line item list. We'll talk a lot about actions and how they're configured in Module 5. And a lot of other properties. I won't go through these in detail now because we cover these in Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. But you see that relations do have a lot of properties. And all of these properties are used to slightly change the form behavior so that it's doing what you want it to do. If a user, for example, modifies a form and then hits the accept button, what do you want the form to do when he does that? Do you want it to exit so that it goes back to, let's say, the list form? Or do you want it to stay there with the grid form open, for example? Entities can have more than one relation associated with them. So that's what you see here in this screenshot. We've got this line item list has two different relations connecting it to the line item form entity. So typically the reason that you have more than one relation is because you have more than one task associated with that form. So that lets you reuse the same form. You don't have to create a bunch of forms that are almost identical and use one of the forms for add operations and use another form for modify operations. So instead, it's handled this way. Right? I can have multiple relations to the same form, but one of those is for, let's say, a task of adding an item in this example. Another might just be to view an item. So modify an item. So there might be three different relations between this entity and the line item entity, and each relation is specific to a different task, like add, modify, or view. And all the properties then can be tweaked and changed so that the behavior for that specific task, like add or modify, is just what it should be when a user goes in and adds an item versus going in and modifying an item. You might want it to do different things based on the task. And that's what the relations are for, why the multiple relations are there. So we actually have a good example of that right here in the Pool Doctors app. Notice here we've got this job detail list is related here to the job detail grid form. And notice it has a 3 there, and that number means that there's 3 different relations between those two form entities. So if I pull over the properties, you can see just by the names of the relations, right? So there's 3 of them. Here they are. I've got JD append, job detail append. I've got JD update, and I've got JD view. So each one of these relations is there to determine the behavior of this form, this job detail grid form over here, when it's opened for one of these associated tasks. So, for example, JD append, just take a look at a few of the, notice there's a special action that the user selected in the job detail list to cause the form to open using this relation, and the name of that action was append. So that's telling us what causes the form to open in this mode, this add mode. So the user selected append. We're telling the form here that we want it to open in this special mode, add. So it will be an add mode so that the user can go ahead and start, it's basically an empty form, so that he can go in and start adding this new detail item or whatever it happens to be. So that's why we have these multiple relations. We can specify for that one relation all these different properties that have different behavior than properties we might use for update. So let's look at the update, and notice the open mode for update is different, right? It's modify. So it won't be an empty form at this point. It'll have the record in it that was selected in the previous form, and then we'll be sitting there able to modify that record because it's opened in modify mode, open mode. So just to give you kind of an idea about how these properties are used. So each one of these relations are for a separate task, and each task, append, update, or view, all has these properties set slightly differently. And a lot of times you won't get these properties right the first time, right? You'll have to set the properties the best you can, and then you go and you run the application, you execute it, you try it, and you see what the behavior is, and there'll be something you don't like, and you go back and try some different settings, right? Or change the settings until you're happy with what it does. So that's what the multiple relations is for, and it's not always because we have, append, modify, and view capabilities. Sometimes there's multiple relations between one entity and 2 or 3 other entities, and it shows up as a 2 or 3, even though it's pointing to different entities. And you'll see some of that too in Pool Doctors. But if it's a number like this and it's going to the same entity, it's typically because we've got different tasks associated with that form, like that line item form. Now here are some properties that are associated with mobile relations, all those device features that we talked about yesterday, or device entities they call them. So yesterday we talked some about using Genero Mobile, and especially with BAM, you don't have to know a lot about the device API. Instead, we have front calls that you can use if you want to use code manually or use custom code. But if you use BAM, you don't even really have to know anything about these special front calls that we provide. We have a library of those. All you really have to know in BAM is how to set properties. So the properties for all the different device entities are pretty simple and straightforward. Typically it's just specify the type of device entity, and you usually do that when you create the entity. You pick the type when you create it, and then you go in and specify an action that's used, what action the user selects to invoke the device entity, and then typically you specify some parameters, like in this case it's a query, and it's specifying usually the columns in the database that are used to be able to make a phone call or identify a location in Google Maps, for example. So it's usually very simple and straightforward. We'll do at least one of these in the labs this week, and we'll look at all of them if you like, or at least look at 2 or 3 of them. But all of them are fairly simple to configure and much easier than having to do all the coding by hand. So let's go ahead and take a look at Module 4. This is our last module today on modeling the database. It's another really short chapter, so that'll be nice, and it'll give you time to work on your labs. You actually have 2 labs today. You'll have a lab for Module 3 and a lab for Module 4. So a lot of lab activities to do. So the learning objectives for Chapter 4, we want to understand the purpose and types of metaschema files. We talked about them briefly in the last chapter, but now we're going to really talk about the difference in what you can do with metaschema files, what they're really for. We'll talk about working with the default database. If you remember from looking at the default project structure that you get when you create a new BAM mobile project, if you remember, it came with an existing or a default database. So there's a more or less empty SQLite database already sitting out there in your new project directory structure for you to use during your development process. But if you have an existing database, a database that you're using for other projects for work, you can also not use the default database. Instead, you can connect to your existing database and use that instead. And if you determine that you're going to use an existing database, one of the steps that you'll need to do to be able to do that for this new development is generate and modify or generate a metaschema for that existing database for your project to use. So we'll learn how to do that in this chapter as well. We'll also learn how to modify the metaschema, whether it's new or an existing. And once you modify the metaschema, you can actually generate a script that in turn will go back and update the actual physical database to make all the changes that you've already made to the metaschema. And that's a way of synchronizing the two so that they stay in sync, which you can imagine is very important to keep your metaschema in sync with the actual underlying physical database. So if you modify your metaschema, it's going to show you green plus signs, for example, and all kinds of color-coded icons that let you know when you've made a change that has not yet been synchronized with the actual physical database, so that you're aware that you need to do something to synchronize them. Revert a change. Let's say you make some changes to your metaschema and then later on you decide you're not happy with those changes. You can revert them. Just about everything we do with Genero has this nice revert option so that we don't have to remember exactly what we did. We can just use that revert option and then pick and choose what we revert from there. I mentioned already that there's an option to generate a script to update the database. So if you make changes to the metaschema, eventually you'll need to update the actual database before you use those new database elements that you've configured with the metaschema. You can also centralize attributes about your tables and columns at the metaschema level, which is very handy for working with forms, especially when you create forms. You can have your, let's say, your labels and your widgets that you use, like edit widgets, button edit widgets, combo box that you expect to use for something like customer code fields and that type of thing. You can go ahead and create those at the metaschema level, or configure those at the metaschema level, and then anytime you create a new form based on that column, it will use these centralized attributes like the label, the widget type, and so on. So that's a handy thing that saves a lot of work, a lot of repetition and work. And then finally we'll talk about BAM serial column management and what that all addresses. That one lone table that you have in your default database in your new project structure when you create a BAM mobile project has to do with this last bullet point, this BAM serial column management. So we'll address that here at the end of the chapter. So mobile apps can communicate with a local or a remote database, and by local we're talking about a database that sits on the actual physical device. So if you do need a database on the physical device, like Pool Doctors, right? The Pool Doctors application that we're using this week and next week does have to have a local database. The job technician that we talked about yesterday has his mobile device with him on the job site, and he has to be able to make updates to the job and add information to the job and store that locally on that physical device, that mobile device, until such a time that he has a network connection and can go ahead and synchronize with a back-end server. So any applications like Pool Doctors that require a local database, the only database supported right now is SQLite. So SQLite is what Genero Mobile supports for local databases that are going to reside on the device. For development purposes, you can create a new database. We talked about the default database that's out there. That's just what that's for. You can change the name of it, change the name of the metaschema file, and just start creating all of your tables and columns and keys from scratch, basically, if you want to, by using that default structure that's already in place in the project that you created. So you can create a new one from scratch, or if you have an existing database, you can add that existing database to your mobile project and use it, or connect to it from your mobile project. For deployment, these local databases that are going to run on the physical device, you have two options for getting those on the physical device. One method is just to provide that database in the deployment package itself, and that's what you're seeing up here with this screenshot. Here's this package that's about to be created, and it has the database directory in it, and you can have the database in that directory structure so that it gets packaged with the rest of the files for the app. So that's one method of doing it, is just packaging the database with the other application files. The other option is maybe more common, and that's to actually go out and create the database. Actually have custom code in the application to create the database the first time the application is executed. And again, that's what Pool Doctors does, right? Pool Doctors actually creates the database the first time it's executed. So it actually creates it right then and there when you run the program. So if you have a synchronizing routine, like Pool Doctors has. Pool Doctors, if you remember, we talked about this yesterday some. The job technician is supposed to be able to take pictures and create timesheet entries, make notes about the project as he's doing it, and then when he finishes the job, he needs to be able to send all that job information for the completed job back to the back-end server. In a case like that, it doesn't matter what the back-end database type is. So any type of database that Genero supports, and that's most of them, is just fine for a sync routine, right? As long as it's running on a back-end server somewhere, it doesn't matter what kind of database that is. But the database on the device does have to be SQLite. We've talked about metaschema files some, and here it's going back to the idea that there's two different kinds. If you're just working with a standard desktop application, you typically would use a 4DB. That's what we use for standard projects. For BAM projects, we use the 4DBX metaschema files that we saw a few minutes ago when we were exploring the project structure. So these 4DBX files, or these special metaschema files, have special features that we use in BAM. For example, this SecReg table that I've mentioned a few times, that's the only table that exists in your default database when you create a new project. And it's there for managing serial columns that we use for primary keys. So we use these special metaschema files that are designed just for BAM purposes to make things easier for development. There's a picture of the SecReg table, but I think we have a better view of it here in another slide. If not, we'll come back here. So there's the default database. We looked at it briefly a few minutes ago, but it's mydatabase.db. That's a SQLite database sitting out there in your project directory structure in that database directory that we looked at a while ago. And it also includes a metaschema file, the mydatabase.4dbx. So they have odd names, right? Very simple names. So if you want to rename the database file and the metaschema file, you can. Just make sure you rename both of them, and don't forget to update that FGL profile that we looked at a few minutes ago to point to your newly renamed database. Make sure it's pointing to the right database. So you'll need to update all three things, right? The schema file name, the database name, and then the FGL profile. You'll need to update it as well. So there is the SecReg table. So it's basically an empty database, and from that point you could just go right there into this metaschema working area, the metaschema manager they call it, and you can go in and start creating new tables and columns, keys, constraints, and adding those to your metaschema file. Now while you're working on them, they're in this working area here in the metaschema manager. It's not actually updating the actual physical database, the SQLite database. Instead, when you're finished updating your schema file, you have the option then of creating a script, and you run that script to go update the physical database. So it's a two-step process essentially. You set up the metaschema the way you want it, and when you're happy with the metaschema, you actually update the database. So we said that you could either start from scratch with this created default database, that My Database that we just looked at, and create all your tables and columns and whatnot that you wanted to use for your brand new project. But in a lot of cases, you may have an existing database that this application is based on that's already out there in your environment. So if that's the case, you can just delete the default database and the default Metaschema file, just delete them out of the project structure and go ahead then and configure a connection to your existing database. And that's what it's showing you here. So notice they've gone in and set up a connection to the existing Pool Doctors database. So there's our FGL profile for our project. And then over here, it is a SQLite database. We can tell from the driver here. And then they're specifying Pool Doctors and the database file, the physical database files for the Pool Doctors database. So you could also specify the full path of the database here. Instead of just pooldoctors.db like we have here, you could specify the full path to the Pool Doctors database so that Genero could find the database. Otherwise, you'll want to check your DB path environment variable and make sure that that database file is in your DB path. So if you use an existing database, you don't yet have an existing Metaschema for it, right, in your project. So one of the things you have to do if you're going to use an existing database is create that Metaschema that we've talked about for that database that's based on that database. So it's a fairly simple process. There's a special option under the Database menu option, Database Extract Schema. So you just follow the wizard. There's a wizard that allows you to generate it. You just walk through the wizard, and right here in the connection information, if you're working with a database that's going to be a local database, it's going to need to be a SQLite. So it'll be SQLite. There's the driver for SQLite, DBM SQT. That's our default. So if you're using SQLite, you wouldn't even have to worry about that part. And then down here, you actually specify the path of the physical database file. So you can browse for it, or you can just type it in. And then there's a test down here where you can test the connection to that database to make sure you have all your settings right. And they've done that here in this screenshot, and it came back successful. So you'd want to test that connection before you went on to try to actually extract the schema. So here in the Metaschema Manager, I mentioned that you could go ahead and create new tables and columns for your database if you like, right there in the Metaschema. And then if you have an existing database, or even if it's a new database, you then turn around and generate a script that's used to update the database. So there's the options to add a table, add a column, add a constraint or an index or a foreign key, and so on. Now we've talked about reverting all these different types of changes. You know, Code Editor has all these options to copy to write we saw on Monday so that you could revert out of changes that you've made. But we also have the same functionality here in the Metaschema Manager. So if you've made some changes, you're not happy with those changes, you can revert out of them one change at a time or all the changes at once if you prefer. So if you just right-click, which is what they've done here on this job detail table, you can right-click on it, there's a revert option, and then from the revert option you can select the change that you want to revert. So notice there's checkboxes on all these different changes, and then right here it's going to tell you what the resulting action is, which is typically to back out of a change to the data type, for example in this case, or a change to the size of the column or whatnot. So it tells you what the change was and what you'll be reverting. So essentially all these changes that you see are based on the changes to the Metaschema since the last time it was synchronized with the database. Now once you synchronize the Metaschema with the database by generating and running a script, then you don't see these color-coded icons the green color-coded icons anymore that tell you you've added something new. So here's how you use the database menu option to generate a script to update the database after you've made some schema changes. So it's just the database menu option again, generate database update script. So here's your generation options. Typically the defaults work most of the time. There's been a few cases where I don't let it generate sample data down here at the bottom because especially for detail tables, the sample data is not always helpful with detail tables because they need to have a key relationship back to the master table. So that sample data in a detail table is usually something you put in yourself. But for master tables, especially, this is a nice option to be able to put some sample data in there so that you can actually see if your form is displaying anything when you're in a development process. But most of the defaults are fine. Generate the primary keys for you to add to the database, right, to create in the actual physical database. You have options here for the primary keys, whether or not you want the primary and foreign keys or just the primary keys. Secondary keys that you have out there, whether or not you want those secondary keys as indexes or not. National char types, character types, special data types that you can use, and again the defaults are fine for most of those. The only one I generally change are the populate database with sample data. I'm sure there's exceptions to that or we wouldn't have these options here, but so far I haven't run into any of those. So centralizing attributes at the schema level, we talked earlier about the benefits of adding all this metadata here at the schema level means that if I create forms, let's say multiple forms that maybe use columns from a specific table, and for that column I have already specified the label that I would like to be displayed in the form. I can specify the widget in the meta schema that I want to use for that specific field in the form, and it will use it every time. Now I can still override that at the form level, but it does save some work when I'm generating a new form or creating a new form. So all my forms then will have the labels already there. Especially if you have multiple programmers working on an application, it's nice to set these kind of standardized labels and widgets right there in the meta schema so that everybody can use them. Nobody has to reinvent the wheel, and everything's nicely standardized that way. You can also set default values. I forgot about that, but you have options for default values you can see highlighted here. Right there at the top under the not null. And then those defaults, labels, and widgets will be used for all the new forms that are generated. And it's used when you're generating the code as well. All of that's built into the code then. So finally, this is the automatic serial column management we've been alluding to in a lot of these slides by seeing this segreg table keeps popping up in the screenshots. So now finally you'll know what that segreg table is all about. For a new mobile project, a BAM mobile project, it automatically creates this one table in your default, otherwise empty database. It's called a segreg table, and you can see it kind of over there towards the right-hand side of the screen, this little guy up here. It's only got two columns in it, the SR name and SR last columns. The SR name is to hold the name of tables that use serial columns as the primary key, like this job header table that we see here in the screenshot has JH code defined as a serial value. And of course, the serial value, the idea is that it's automatically incremented. That's the behavior we would like to have. So JH code number 1, JH code number 2, and so on. So you can set the starting value to whatever you like, but the idea is that it's automatically incremented. So that's the purpose of the segreg table for BAM mobile projects, is to take care of that serial value for you. So it keeps track of the names of the columns that are using these serial values, or names of the tables that have serials used as the primary key. And then it also keeps track of the last value for the serial column, like number 10 or number 11. And that way, anytime a new record is added, a new row is added to the database, it goes ahead and automatically increments that serial primary key for you. So that's the benefit of that SecReg table. It takes care of all of that for you with your BAM mobile project. So if you don't use serials for anything, you could delete the SecReg table. That's the only reason it's there, is in case you're using any serial values for primary keys on your tables. So here's just talking about how do you use the SecReg table. There's really not a whole lot to using it. All you have to do is define your primary key column and specify serial for the data type. And that takes care of it, right? Automatically the SecReg table will make a record of that, add that to the table, and then it will take care of any new rows that are added to the table and incrementing that primary key value for you. Now something that's kind of important here is if you have detail tables, that's the reason I've included that in the screenshot here on the right. Notice that detail tables for the master table, they need to have the code, the foreign key value can't be a serial there, right? It needs to be an integer. And if I remember right, I think small int, I've tried small int, doesn't work. It really needs to be integer. So make sure any detail tables, the foreign key value needs to be integer to correspond with that serial data type for the primary key in the master table. Okay, that wasn't bad at all for that chapter. That was a nice short chapter. Let me just pop over here for a second and show you a few of those things, and then we'll talk about the labs, and I'll turn you loose for the day to work on labs. So a lot of this we've already looked at, so this will probably be a fairly quick demonstration, but here we are in this new project that we created, and we've got this default database, mydatabase.db, and then the 4DBX metaschema file that is put in there with it so that you already have a metaschema file. You can open the metaschema file just by double-clicking. I'm sure there's a right-click option for it as well, open schema file, but typically I just double-click on it. And there's my SecReg table that we've been talking about. So otherwise my database is completely empty. But we talked about being able to go in and add tables right here in the Metaschema Manager working area. And you can just go in and type in the names of tables if you like. Create tables. Then you can go in and set up your columns. Let's see, I'll just call it CNAME, customer name. Specify your data type. And then specify whether or not you want to use a not null constraint on the table. So it's pretty straightforward. Just tab and keep creating columns as you go. And then once you have your column the way you like it, one thing to point out is the green plus sign. If you remember, that's telling me that I have created a new structure in the database, some new element in the database since I have extracted my metaschema, right? Since I've synchronized with the actual physical database. And that green plus sign will stay there until I do generate that script and update the database to match. So just kind of something to catch your eye so that you know that there's still tasks that you need to do. And over here on the right-hand side are properties. So if I go in here, here's my custom table. I've got this CNAME property. And right here is where I can configure the label I want to use for it. I'll say customer name, and then I can specify a widget. I think the edit widget, that's our default widget, and that's what we use for most fields unless they need some sort of special behavior. Like here's all the different options, and all of these have special behavior, like button edit. We use that to trigger a Zoom form, for example, or a combo box to let the user pick from a list of values. So unless it has some kind of special requirement that you want to use, it's typically a button edit. An edit, not a button edit. So typically we'll use the default edit widget. But there's cases like date fields and that type of thing where we have special widgets that you might want to use for those. Like there's a date edit widget, a date time edit widget that allows the user to pick the value he wants instead of having to type it in by hand. So that's the benefit of using some of those widgets. It makes it easier for the user to make a selection. So there's how we store some of these special values that we want to use in all of our newly generated forms. We can store them right here in the meta schema. So now if I generate a form based on this table and this column, it's going to inherit all of these special properties that I've just set up. So that's the idea there. So I do need to generate a script at that point. So if you remember, I'll just show you where these are. There's the database menu option. Here's all these different options where I can update the schema, which is handy if I've made a change to the database or I've updated the database and I want to update the schema now to synchronize it. I can use that option. Here's the option we talked about earlier in this chapter, just to generate a new schema file. Here's the option to create a new database. Now typically here we're not interested in that option because we already have an existing database. It's just kind of empty. What we'd probably use is this option right here, Generate Database Update Script. So that's the option we'd pick. And there's that Choose Generation Options that we saw in the PowerPoint slides. And again, you can use this Populate Database with Sample Data. And then there's the script. So that creates a Genero BDL script with some embedded SQL to create the tables. Drop table, that's your SecReg backup. It also makes backup tables. It's a very nice script generation routine because it creates backup tables and stores the data in those tables in the backup tables. So that way if you've made a change to a table, it creates a backup table, saves off the data, and then recreates the table if it needs to and loads the data back in there. So that's a very nice feature, are these automatic generated scripts. So here it's just got the create table SecReg, and there's my new table, execute immediate, create table custom, and there's my column definitions. And I told it to insert some sample data, so down here at the bottom there's a function here that it's going to call to insert this sample data into my new table. You actually have that all of these steps in your lab this afternoon, so I hate to do any more, but anyway, you would save your script, and typically when we're working with scripts like this that are updating or changing a database, we want to make sure we put them here in our database maintenance group under the Create Database application node, and store them here with a different name or allow it to overwrite. There we go. And then we can execute it from here with this execute option. There we go. And down here at the bottom, I hope you can see that far down, I've run that script, and it says running create database, execution of create database finished, exit code 0. That's what you want to see when you're working with database scripts. You want that exit 0 status, and that means that it was successful. So we have a few things for you to do with the database in this next lab where you'll be running scripts so that you can see this work. Let's just take a quick look at the labs to see what you've got in store for the labs. Look at the Module 3 lab first, and then I'll turn you loose to actually do the labs. So the first thing, you're going to prepare your lab environment by creating a new directory. We're going to call that Pool Doctors. I put mine on the D drive, but you can put yours anywhere you like, right? Just as long as you have plenty of space there. Not that it's very big, but just make sure you have enough space for a little project. and D, Pool Doctors, was where I opted to put mine. And then in the course materials link, you need to make sure you find that zip file, that Pool Doctors base lab zip file that I was talking about, download it, and then extract the files to that new directory you create. So that will be your project dir. In my case, my project dir is D Pool Doctors. Yours might be a little different. It might be C Pool Doctors or something different based on your platform even. And then you want to launch Genero Mobile and use the File Open option to browse for the .4pw file. Now another way you could do that is just to go to your directory structure, right? Go to, like in my example, D Pool Doctors, and you can just typically double click on the .4pw file to open it in Genero Mobile, or you can right click on the file and there's options there that you can pick to open it in Genero Mobile 1.1. So any of those methods work, or you can just follow the lab instructions. So then we're going to explore Project Manager and the existing project structure. So we've done a lot of that in class today, so a lot of this will just be a review for you, but you're just going to go out and look at all the different project structures, see all the changes that we've made to the default project structure, all the new libraries and virtual folders and whatnot. Then you're going to explore some of the menu options, the right-click menu options. And in exercise 3, you're going to do a similar thing with the BAM diagrams. You're going to take a look at the BA diagram for Pool Doctors to get more familiar with it, kind of explore that and look at the different entity types out there. A few questions to kind of help you think about the BA diagram and the functionality of the BA diagram. Kind of make you try to follow the application flow is the idea of that lab. See if you can figure out what the user should be able to do and where he's going to go from the first screen and then the next form and so on. Then you're going to look at some of those properties just like we did in the class. So again, some of this is just going to be a review. And then in exercise 4, we're going to have you model a Zoom form. Eventually, that Zoom form will be used to look up products. You won't implement the form yet. You're just drawing out the entities. You're just creating your application flow today. And then as we go through the labs tomorrow and the next day, you will be implementing these new entities and their relations. So there's the instructions to add a new Zoom form. And that's what your new Zoom form is going to look like when you finish the steps in that exercise. So notice the green plus sign is going to be there. That means there's no code. It hasn't been implemented. Right now it's just more or less a diagram, a flow, application flow diagram. And in exercise 5, you're going to model a device entity, and we're going to model the maps entity so that you can get a look at how that works, the device entity functionality for maps. So again, this one, this form or this entity is not going to be implemented yet either. We'll be working on this more in Module 5 and Module 6. And that's it for Lab 3. So Lab 3, you're going to be doing some modeling, but you won't yet be implementing. Now you also need to make sure you do the Module 4 lab today. So you actually have 2 labs. So here's the Module 4 lab. The first exercise is just exploring the existing database model. So this is the Pool Doctors database that we're talking about here. And you're looking at the metaschema file. So you're exploring the tables, checking for serial values and that type of thing. Some of the things we've talked about in the exercise or in the chapter today. And then here we're getting ready to model a couple of forms that we're going to use to implement the ability of the technician to be able to add, modify, view notes while he's out on a job. So one of the things about this Pool Doctors project that you've downloaded this morning is that all the notes stuff is not implemented. That's actually going to be part of the exercises in your labs. So here's some mock-ups for you to look at to give you an idea of what you're trying to achieve. And then in this lab, you're going to go ahead and create these entities. But again, we're not going to implement them yet. You just want to create them. So you're going to have this job note list form, and then you're going to create a job note grid form. Now both of those are CRUD forms, right? So list forms and grid forms are still CRUD forms. Zoom forms are similar to list forms, right? They are lists, but they are different types of entities. Remember, they have that very restricted functionality. So both of these, you can see just looking at the icons that are used, these are considered CRUD forms. The Zoom forms, remember, have the big magnifying glass icon sitting on top of them. Then we're going to have you modify the Pool Doctors database model so that you can try some of those menu options that we talked about. The main reason here is because you're going to be implementing this notes functionality in the Pool Doctors application, and to do that you need a job note table. So you're going to create this job note table. You're going to add foreign keys and primary keys to the job note table. Here you're going to generate a script to update the database so that it knows about this new job note table and all of its attributes, all of its constraints and whatnot. Did I go too fast? There we go. All right, and then you're going to run the script. So that's what we're doing here. And again, remember we talked about running these database scripts. You want to make sure that you end with an exit code 0. So that's what we're looking at here. Make sure you end that way. And in exercise 5, we're going to update the schema to synchronize it with our updated database. Right? So now the metaschema file doesn't know that the database has been updated until you synchronize it. And you do that by going out here and updating the schema. So there's the steps to go in and update the schema. It compares itself with what's in the actual physical database now. The job note table will be there, and the green plus signs should go away. Right, so the green plus signs are going to be there until you update the database and then update the schema to synchronize it with the newly updated database. And then you're going to add some rows to the job note table. The job note table is a detail table, and I mentioned earlier that the sample data that we provide when you generate a script doesn't work too well sometimes for detail tables because they need to have rows in them that correlate or correspond back to their master table. So instead of using the sample data here when we generate this new job note table, we're actually going to run a script that I've created, and you're just going to load 3 rows of valid data that you can use to work with that new notes forms that you're creating, the 2 new notes forms. So that's what you're doing there. You're actually loading some valid data as opposed to sample data. And then finally, exercise 7, we talked about centralizing attributes in the metaschema, and that's what exercise 7 has you do. You're going to go ahead and set your labels, your widgets. I don't think I have any default values out here for you to set, but you will be setting labels and widgets. And that's it. Right? So there is a summary so that you can kind of read that. Sometimes working through labs you get a little overwhelmed and it's hard to remember exactly what you've done and what you haven't done and why you did it. So at the end of this lab I've got a summary so that you can figure out where you're at and what you still need to do. Okay, well that puts us to the end of today. So we were able to kick off 2 chapters today. So we did 2 chapters yesterday, 2 chapters today. So now we just have 1 chapter per day for the rest of the class, the next 2 weeks or so.